reforms undertaken since devolution. The committee therefore decided that the 5-year anniversary of the creation of Police Scotland and the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service, and given the media attention the reforms have attracted, was an opportune time to embark on post-legislative scrutiny of the Act. I'm pleased to speak on behalf of the committee on its findings in terms of establishing whether the policy intentions of the Act are being met and assessing how the legislation is working in practice. The Act abolished Scotland's 8 police forces and replaced them with Police Scotland, a single national force, and the Scottish Police Authority, an oversight body. The main driver for the reform was the need to make efficiencies in the face of spending reductions. The financial memorandum issued with the bill estimated that the single police service would achieve efficiency savings of £1.1 billion by 2026. However, this estimate was based on an outlined business case, OBC, only, and not a fully developed set of costings. In addition to this, it failed to take into account the day-to-day challenges facing the police service or the demands on the service as responders of first and last resort. Unison described the basis of the OBC as oversimplistic, and the Superintendents Association described the estimated savings as unrealistic. Consequently, costs were underestimated, and the committee found the financial memorandum was not suitably robust. Despite this, Police Scotland has achieved a cumulative cost savings of £330 million. This in part is due to the successful reduction in duplication in support services. The committee considered this to be commended. Furthermore, another benefit of reform is Police Scotland's ability to provide more equal access to specialist support and national capacity across Scotland. This is demonstrated by the way it has transformed how it investigates domestic abuse, rape and other sexual crimes. And during a recent visit to Gallowshield Police Station, the committee heard about how they had requested and received helicopter assistance to trace the missing person. But realistically, whilst local areas are able to bid for specialist resources, such as counter-terrorism support, there is no guarantee this will be available. The committee therefore concluded that the system is not perfect, but by and large, major resources held at national level are available and able to be provided locally if they are needed. Another area where savings have been made is the reduction of police staff numbers. The committee heard that civilian staff posts have been reduced by over 2,000. An unintended consequence of this decision is that police officers are backfilling many of these vacated staff posts instead of being on the front line, as the public might expect. This was a concern raised during the passage of the bill, which, 6 years on, has still to be addressed. Staff unions in the police service told the committee of real concerns about staffing numbers versus the demands placed on them. The committee therefore welcomed Police Scotland's commitment to carry out an analysis of demand data in early 2019, and we look forward to seeing the results of that analysis. The Scottish Police Authority has a dual role, oversight and also maintenance of the police service. Issues regarding poor use of public money, leadership, governance and decision-making processes at the SPA have been identified by the Auditor General. In evidence, the lack of engagement and transparency was raised, as were concerns about the influence of Scottish ministers in the appointment of the board chair and members. The committee accepts there should be wide-ranging engagement on the appointment process and considers all options should be explored. The SPA chair outlined a number of measures that are being taken to address these concerns. The committee recommended that Police Scotland and the Scottish Police Authority continue to focus on procedures and practices to avoid any repeat of previous issues and demonstrating that they have achieved the required cultural change in leadership and governance. The Justice Subcommittee was therefore disappointed to hear, prior to summer recess, that police unions and staff associations had been excluded from any pre-budget decision-making processes. Clearly, whilst there have been some improvements in governance and accountability, there is still some way to go. The committee therefore looks forward to the outcome of the Police Inspectorate's review of the effectiveness and efficiency of the Scottish Police Authority in terms of fulfilling its core role. Presiding Officer, it is essential a robust complaint handling system with independent oversight, which the public, police officers and staff can have confidence in, is in place. This is a key area of improvement, as it is evident the handling of police complaints, including Police Scotland's discretion in deciding how complaints are categorised and investigated, is not working as the Act intended. The committee's announcement of its intention to carry out post-legislation scrutiny was followed by the government's announcement that it was considering the review by Dame Eilish Angelini. This has been very much welcomed by the committee. Her interim report, published before summer recess, provides an opportunity for the Scottish Government to make changes quickly to the handling of police complaints. Responding, the Cabinet Secretary said that he was aware that public confidence in the handling of police complaints had been dented and undertook to consider what could be done in the short term. The committee therefore asked the Cabinet Secretary to provide details today of the changes that he intends to introduce. The 2012 Act intended to strengthen the connection between police services and local authorities. The Act provides for more involvement from local authorities in policing decisions. The committee believes that whilst there are some good examples of local partnership working, the policy intention has not been met consistently across the 32 local authorities. More consistency across the country is needed. In concluding the committee's comments about the police reform, it is fair to say that things are improving after a very challenging start, particularly for the SPA, but that more remains to be done. Turning now to the Fire and Rescue Service, now a single service. Audit Scotland found the Fire Service had managed the 2013 merger of the 8 Fire and Rescue Services effectively and continued to deliver emergency and prevention services while progressing a complex and ambitious programme of reform. Currently, the Fire Service is on target to meet and potentially exceed the efficiency savings estimated in the financial memorandum. This is partly due to the reduction in duplication of its support services. It has also maintained frontline services with all 356 stations remaining open. Less encouraging was the evidence the committee heard that current staffing issues presented a risk to the fire service achieving transformation. Audit Scotland described the current model and contractual framework for the retained duties service as not fit for purpose. 4 out of 5 of Scotland's fire stations rely wholly or in part on retained or volunteer firefighters. Some of the issues with the current system include the low basic pay of less than £3,000 and, depending on whether they are based, retained firefighters can be expected to cover a large area, which they may be unwilling or even unable to do. Also, expanding the role of firefighters presents a particular challenge for retained and volunteered firefighters. The changing role includes the provision of emergency medical assistance, which increases their responsibilities and training time commitment. The fire service states it is a priority to resolve the retained firefighting system. In fact, it is a fundamental issue which needs to be resolved. The committee therefore recommends that the Scottish Government considers how to address this issue in an effort to see progress. They ask the Minister to provide an update. The 2012 Act aims to strengthen the relationship between the fire service and local authorities, enabling greater input from councillors and others to shape their local fire services. Engagement and working collaboratively are key priorities for the fire service, which have helped to meet the policy aim of strengthening local relationships and scrutiny. Nonetheless, further improvements could be made to ensure that local impacts are considered when deciding on changes to national policy and to provide greater autonomy to local senior officers to enable them to respond to their priorities within their local areas. To conclude, Presiding Officer, both the single police force and fire services plan significant changes to how they work. This needs to be managed with officers and staff fully involved in these changes. Increased demands and expected efficiency savings, together with budgets set by the government and the lack of resources affecting fleet, estate and police numbers, remain challenging issues. Presiding Officer, it is essential that these vital services are funded to meet these demands. The Justice Committee will therefore continue to keep these reforms under review, and I move the motion in my name.
Thank you very much, Convener, and I call on the Cabinet Secretary Hamza Youssef to open for the Government.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I thank the Convener for her opening remarks. And I, of course, thank the Justice Committee, the members and, of course, the clerks involved for bringing forward their report on this important issue. And I'm looking forward to what I think will be a very constructive and no doubt even in some respects a challenging debate. This debate, of course, is considering the groundbreaking 2012 Police and Fire Reform Scotland Act, which was passed by this Parliament following very detailed scrutiny in June 2012. We recognise that the Act would underpin the most significant public service reform in Scotland since devolution, and a bold move to protect these crucial public services from the impact of unprecedented cuts to public spending. And as importantly, the Act provided a clear and modern purpose and principles for both the Police Service of Scotland and indeed SFRS. I appreciate the committee's robust scrutiny of the implementation of the 2012 Act and the evidence to the committee from a diverse range of stakeholders. The committee's report recognises significant achievements, including the creation of national capabilities in policing and fire and rescue, which have improved the service to communities, but also, of course, as the convener has highlighted already in her opening remarks, remind us of where the challenges still exist. Bringing together legacy arrangements into single services with appropriate governance and oversight has been challenging. However, reports published by an independent consortium led by the Scottish Institute of Policing Research demonstrate there is plausible and credible evidence of progress being made towards achieving the three long-term aims of reform. Furthermore, Audit Scotland's 2015 review of fire reform concluded that the merger of the 8 fire and rescue services was managed effectively and the performance of SFRS was improving, and the move to a national organisation was enhanced scrutiny and challenge. The first 6 years of the 2 national services have included many achievements and milestones. Of course, I get away.
Daniel Johnson.
Indeed, Audit Scotland did acknowledge those things, but they also pointed out that the police was being severely hampered by a capital backlog. I was just wondering if the Cabinet Secretary could comment on what the government will do to ensure that the police can make the capital investments it needs to.
Cabinet Secretary.
It's a good point and an important point that Daniel Johnson has pressed me before in the policing subcommittee. In the last spending review round, of course, the Chief Constable, SPA and others made their plea for additional capital funding. This government stepped up to the plate. We increased the capital funding by 52%, a 12 million uplift. Clearly, we're hearing from Police Scotland, from SPA, from the Scottish Police Federation, and many others that they think there is a need for further investment. I am open-minded to listening to them on that, for the fleet, for the estate, and indeed for further investment in ICT. So they have very much an open door to me. These discussions will take place, of course, in private between myself and the Finance Secretary, but I think the point around capital and the share of capital versus resource of Police Scotland is a point that's well worth making. In terms of, I mentioned some of the challenges. We just talked about one of the challenges there around Police Scotland. I want to focus a little bit on some of the achievements, because I think they are hugely important. I thought the evidence that the committee took was very stark in that regard. The Chief Constable, I thought, was very clear that he didn't think Scotland would be as safe without reform. Policing services in Scotland have been protected and improved, and duplication has been reduced. And one of the most powerful testimonies, I think, in terms of the achievements of Police Scotland and the creation of the National Single Service was from Rape Crisis Scotland. They noted, and I quote from them directly, "The move to a single police force has transformed the way rape and other sexual crimes are investigated in Scotland, highlighting greater consistency, training and the use of specialist officers." So we have more officers now also than at any time during the previous administration. In the absence of sufficient UK Government funding, the Scottish Government has committed an additional 17 million this year to ensure police officer numbers are sufficiently able to manage the impact of a no-deal EU exit if that should occur. Current numbers are 17,259. That's an increase of 1,025 police officers, of course.
Liam Kerr.
Just on that point he's just made, he would presumably accept that 400 of those officers are funded directly by the UK Government, and 300, I think, are directly funded by our hard-pressed local councils.
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, of course, the funding comes from the Scottish Government, but I accept what he says in relation to some of the officers. I would say, if you were looking at the UK Government's track record of police numbers, for the ones that they fund the majority, of course, forces in England and Wales, it's not quite a rosy picture. They've reduced officer numbers by in and around 20,000. I notice and note with great interest that the current Prime Minister says that he will reverse that, but it is just that. It is just a reversal of the 20,000 officers that have been cut. So although I applaud his suggestion that this is coming from the UK Government and local authorities, I think it's fair to say the Scottish Government has stepped up to the plate by protecting police revenue funding, increasing capital funding, and that has allowed us to have the 1,025 additional officers we have now in Scotland in the position we inherited in 2007. But that's not to take our eyes off the ball. I think it's important that we continue to get challenged and pressed around police funding and additional resources, and of course we'll continue to listen to those calls as they come in, and I will continue to engage very closely with the Chair of the SPA and the Chief Constable. In terms of what else we've managed to achieve, it's important to mention that we have safely, and Police Scotland, I should say, have safely and securely delivered a number of major international events. Many of us will have enjoyed the 2014 Commonwealth Games, and many of us are looking forward to major international events which the police will also play a role in. For example, COP26 coming to Glasgow. So we'll continue to fund and protect the funding for Police Scotland in terms of revenue. We'll also continue to value our police officers. That 6.5% pay deal for officers, the best in 2 decades, as described by the Scottish Police Federation. And we'll continue to invest in the capital side and listen to the concerns that the police have in and around that, and ensure that we continue to fund them in a way that is appropriate. I wanted to touch on the points made by the convener around Dame Elise Angelini's interim report published in June. I thought it was a very helpful report, a very weighty interim report with a number of recommendations. And the Justice Committee put the challenge to me that they wanted the government to act quickly, and where could we prioritise. And I thought there was a number of areas of priority that the partners can look at. I think from a Scottish Government, I can speak from the Scottish Government's perspective, the issue around clarifying complaints against those that are serving or no longer serving in the police. I know that was something that the convener pressed me on personally at the Justice Committee, to give her an assurance. I'm very actively looking at what legislative vehicle we can find to bring that forward in this parliamentary term, and sooner rather than later. Now, we are constrained because the parliamentary timetable is very full, but we think there may be a way to do that with another legislative vehicle, potentially piggybacking on the back of a potential other legislative vehicle. Now, I can give the committee convener more detail, of course, if she wants in writing. I've also can confirm that the partners involved, the Scottish Police Federation, Scottish Police Association, Police Scotland, and ourselves and others will meet regularly to discuss how we take forward Dame Elise Angelini's review. I spoke to the Chief Constable yesterday about that. I was due to speak to Dame Elise Angelini today, but unfortunately that meeting had to be moved. If I can just focus my concluding remarks on Scottish Fire and Rescue Service, I should have, at the beginning of my remarks, given my apologies to the from the Minister of Community Safety, who would have liked to have been here, but unfortunately she is not feeling well, so has had to head home. SFRS is the largest fire and rescue service in the UK, and of course, although we know that fires and incidents of fire raising have gone down over the years, there are reminders like the incident like last year's Glasgow School of Art fire or the huge wildfires in Murray earlier this year that remind us of the real need to ensure that our fire service is funded and resourced appropriately. And it reminds us, of course, of the sheer bravery of fire teams who are willing to put themselves in danger to assist others. And I'd like to thank our fire officers for all that they do for us. The committee report rightly highlights how SFRS has successfully worked through major transition over the last 6 years. The 2012 Act has facilitated the creation of a number of initiatives, operations and ways of working, such as increasing access to specialist equipment and expertise that simply would not have been possible without that unified service. So protecting frontline services is our priority for 2019-20. The budget provides an additional £5.5 million to allow SFRS to invest in service transformation. I'll come more to that in my closing remarks at the end of this debate. This is, of course, in addition to the spending, the additional increase in spending capacity of the service by £15.5 million in 2018-19. And just to conclude, Presiding Officer, it's worth putting on the record and reminding our colleagues across the Chamber that although those funding challenges still exist, that this Scottish Government will continue to push the UK Government for the payback of the VAT. Police Scotland and SFRS have paid out £175 million in VAT, and I'm going to continue to press for that substantial amount of money to be paid back, and I hope other colleagues can join us in that call. So in conclusion, I've always acknowledged that reform is an ongoing process. Change of this scale is almost unprecedented. There's always going to be some challenges, but I think the general sentiment from the committee's report was we have gone over and managed to overcome the teething problems, the difficult challenges in the beginning of the years of reform. We are in a good place, but there could be challenges ahead, so therefore there's certainly no complacency from this government, and I certainly look forward to the rest of this debate.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. As members may have surmised, there is some time in hand, so I'm being gentle with time to a degree. I call Liam Kerr, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm pleased to have the opportunity to open for the Scottish Conservatives in this debate on the Justice Committee's report on the Police and Fire Reform Act of 2012. I think credit needs to go to the clerks for its production, but also to the witnesses for what I certainly found to be a fascinating and highly informative inquiry. The history of both services is well rehearsed in the reports, with the underlying principles being that the Police and Fire Reform Bill would replace the 8 police forces and the 8 fire brigades with a single police service and a single fire service. And underlying those reforms were 3 fundamental principles: to protect and improve local services by stopping duplication and not cutting frontline services, to create more equal access to specialist support and national capacity, and to strengthen the connection between services and communities. So it was right to ask whether these aims have been met. And perhaps more importantly, it seems to me, we need to then go on to ask whether the lessons are being and have been learned. Now, dealing with the police report first, the report examined another number of issues with the governance structure. Both the current Chief Constable and the Chair told the committee that in the early days of reform, the governance arrangements did not operate properly, and that the SPA suffered from a lack of clarity of purpose. And this led in 2017, following sustained criticism around governance and transparency, to the 3rd Chair in 4 years stepping down. And then last year, the Chief Executive changed again, which was not without controversy. And amidst that turmoil, the Chief Constable Phil Gormley resigned, writing in his resignation statement that it was the events of November 2017 involving the then Cabinet Secretary that had made it impossible for him to carry on. The report was clear, however, that the present Chief Constable, the SPA Chair and the Cabinet Secretary all feel that the Act does not need to change in relation to governance. And the committee broadly agreed, noting that such matters were unduly affected by personalities. The committee did note the need for a culture change, which is why it's somewhat concerning to note that the current Chief Executive of the SPA, who's been in post for less than a year, is now leaving. Now, such things cannot be predicted, and of course, we wish Mr. Grover well, but the lack of stability is not helpful. Moving on, I'm keen to pick up on the report noting that the issue of police officers backfilling police staff roles raised during stage 3 of the consideration of the bill remains a live one. It's hardly surprising because reportedly 800 staff have been lost to police and fire services since 2013. And I note Dr. Kath Murray's submission that staff roles were reduced by 40% between 2010 and 2018. Now that is bound to have an impact. And it's notable that over half of police divisions in Scotland have fewer officers on the front line since the 2013 merger. And that's having an impact right now. I know, yes, of course.
Cabinet Secretary.
I thank Liam Kerr for giving me. There's just 2 points I wondered if you agreed with. One, when it comes to the staff, and of course we should keep an eye on that, that a lot of the reason, the purpose was to reduce duplication of the 8 forces then coming into one. So would you agree with that? And the second point I wanted to make was the point that Rape Crisis Scotland made, that actually with the creation of a single service, we now have national capability. So some officers not being on the front line, but actually providing a service nationally means that they're providing a service to local services around rape, investigation of rape, domestic abuse, and other such things.
Liam Kerr.
I actually understand the point the Cabinet Secretary is making. Yes, of course, this was about reducing duplication, and yes, there are national services. But remember, if we're removing officers from the front line, at the end of the day, they are the first point of contact for many of these people. So that's going to have an impact. And the point I'm making is that this is having an impact, a very serious impact, on the officers and staff themselves. I know Oliver Mundell is going to talk about the local impact in detail later on, but I hear from sources in Aberdeen that the ability of police in Aberdeen to crack down on drug dealing may be being compromised by an insufficiency of numbers to cover when we've got offshore Europe, for example, the court at Balmoral, as well as those patrols. And that's got to be concerning. I'm sure the Cabinet Secretary agrees, especially if there would be things like leave being taken over the summer months. And that final aside brings me to page 63 of the report, which deals with, inter alia, the needs of staff and officers both during and following the reform process. Just last week, Police Scotland's chaplain wrote to the Cabinet Secretary to highlight that this under-resourcing has left officers tired, frustrated and depressed, and requesting better resourcing and more officers employed. And the Scottish Police Federation say officers are run ragged and can't even go for a toilet break, never mind having a sandwich or a quick tea or a coffee. Now I think, and I'm certain the Cabinet Secretary will agree, but I think that's no way to treat people who put their lives on the line daily to protect us. Now, Gordon Lyndhurst will speak to the news that at least 70 million extra is required to avoid a further reduction of apparently 350 to the workforce, and that the police capital budget has been cut by 56 million. This last is especially concerning as the submission from Police Scotland to the Justice Subcommittee, as raised by Daniel Johnson in his intervention, shows that only 43% of the police's capital funding requirements are being met. That's why the Federation say that police are driving barely legal vehicles. It's why the Federation report on Oban Police Station being unfit for human habitation. And I know Maurice Corrie is going to deal with the digital data and ICT, but in brief, we know that the SNP have failed to fund the crucial technology upgrades that police officers need. Presiding Officer, the UK government has pledged hundreds of millions to boost the number of frontline officers, and that will lead to Barnett consequentials of around £80 million. And perhaps the Cabinet Secretary will confirm in closing whether he is demanding the Finance Secretary pass this on to the police in the forthcoming budget. Presiding Officer, I have little time left. One of the things that has been somewhat less high profile in this inquiry is the fire service, and I think there are good reasons for that insofar as the report shows the merger hasn't been beset by the challenges that the police face. And I think credit to those who were involved in it. In fact, the report concludes the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service Board has managed the merger effectively and demonstrated good governance and management of the service. However, again, in making sense of looking back, we must look forward. The Fire Brigades Union say there are 917 fewer firefighters than in 2010. And I think questions need to be answered again, perhaps in closing, about whether this will continue. And if so, at what point it becomes challenging for the service to continue to discharge the duties it does so well at present. And the convener certainly raised some interesting points that Audit Scotland flagged, which again, it would be good to hear from the Cabinet Secretary on. in closing. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, I commend these reports to the Chamber, not only for what they tell us about the process of the previous years, but for also what we can all learn for the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Kelly. I call James Kelly. Mr Kelly, please.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. It gives me great pleasure to open this debate on behalf of Scottish Labour. I want to start off by thanking the members of the Justice Committee, the witnesses and the clerks for the amount of work that they've clearly put into this process. Reading both of the reports, it's clear there's a lot of detail that has been examined. The conclusions have been seriously considered and thought about, and I hope that the Government will take the report seriously. I should say at the outset that obviously the process is to consider the impact of the 2012 Act. I think that's essential for the Parliament, an essential act for the Parliament to undertake. I was involved in the debates and discussions about the movement to a single force, ahead of the 2011 election and then under consideration of the 2012 Act. Scottish Labour supported those moves, believing that it would lead to an improvement in services and a more efficient running of both organisations. And I think carrying out this post-legislative work is important at this time in order to review how successful the implementation and operation of the Act has been and what lessons that can be learned. And in examining both reports, there clearly are issues to pick up on. In terms of governance, which has already been touched upon by Liam Kerr, clearly there are issues. There have been issues around the SPA. We have seen changes in personnel and controversies over the appointment process. And I know we've got a new SPA chair in Susan Deakin, and some of those processes have been tightened up on. There's also been questions of the role of Scottish ministers, particularly in relation to the position of Chief Constable Gormley. And I think the lesson to learn is that perhaps there's just a lack of clarity around what are the procedures that underpin the governance arrangements, both of the SPA and also the role of Scottish ministers. And I think the government would be well advised to take that on board. I think one of the big issues that runs through both reports is that of budgets. And crucially, you need adequate budgets in order to support the not just. Yes, surely. Yeah.
Jenny Gilruth.
On the issue of budgets, does James Kelly agree that the UK Government should fully refund Police Scotland for the £125 million paid already in VAT between 2013 and 2018?
James Kelly.
Yeah, well, that issue has already been addressed by Scottish Labour. Moving on to the issue of no, I'm not taking another intervention. Moving on to the issue of how Police Scotland is funded, I think it is a matter of concern that in the evidence that was submitted by Deputy Chief Constable Will Kerr, he indicated that there was a deficit of £35.7 million, and that could lead to a potential shortfall of 700 officers. I think that's a warning that the government would do well to heed. And I think it feeds into this issue of frontline police numbers and the issue of backfilling, which has been raised over the years by Unison and others, that support staff posts and other posts have been used to backfill officers that have been taken off the front line. And ultimately the concern's got to be that the actual service and the protection of the public may be crucially undermined. I think one of the big issues that the committee have looked at is that of information technology. It's fair to say, and I think even the government would acknowledge this, that the issue of information technology in the police service has been one that's been a real challenge. I mean, in 2013, a new system was spec'd out, I6, at a cost of £46 million. Ultimately, the contract with Accenture had to be terminated because of failures in terms of the delivery against spec, and really a breakdown of the whole process. And the committee have made the point that the financial memorandum underestimated the costs required in information technology. And I think in terms of where we are now, it's a real matter of concern that the Auditor General wasn't able to give proper assurance that there was going to be sufficient IT capability in place for Police Scotland to meet their IT needs. I think in any modern public service, particularly the police, information technology is really important, and there are clearly issues there that will need to be addressed. Briefly, in terms of the fire service, I'm conscious that I'm running out of time. I think it's interesting to note that...
I can give you an extra minute, so you don't have to curtail your comments. I'm being very gentle with you, Mr.
Okay,
Kelly.
yeah, I appreciate that, Deputy Presiding Officer. So in terms of the fire service, I think it's interesting to look at the position of the FBU. The FBU are very supportive of the move, very vocal about the move to a single service back in 2012. They saw the clear advantages of that. But in submissions ahead of this debate, they've been pointing out that there are 648 less firefighters. So, I think the concern there would be that there's not the same frontline capability that there was previously. So you would then ask the question, has the move to a single service achieved its objective in terms of maintaining and improving on that frontline service? I think there's also an issue around when you move to a single service from multiple organisations or sub-organisations around the country, there always is going to be this tension about centralisation versus local control, and that was one of the big debates in 2012. But I think in terms of the fire service, there are still some issues to be addressed there. I mean, yesterday at Justice Portfolio Questions, we heard Lewis MacDonald raise the issue of gold commanders who are responsible if there's a kind of catastrophic incident, and the 3 commanders are currently based at Cambuslang. If there was a catastrophic incident in the northeast, they would be one of the commanders would be moved to Dundee, but that's far away from Aberdeen, or from the North Sea, where there might potentially be an incident on an oil rig. So I think there are issues there that still need to be flushed out. So in summing up, Deputy Presiding Officer, I think these are important reports that the committee have brought forward to the Chamber today. It's right that we reflect and learn the lessons from the move to the single service. There's no doubt there are a number of issues around governance, budgets and local accountability that the government need to look into seriously, and hopefully take some of the crucial points that the committee have made on board.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. I call John Finney. Mr. Finney, please.
Thank you very much indeed, Presiding Officer. And I would concur with the comments of my colleague James Kelly there that post-legislative scrutiny is very important, and it's perhaps unfortunate that due to work demands we don't get the opportunity to do more of it in the Parliament. I think, and I would want to pay tribute to the people who gave evidence to the committee and the committee clerks as ever. Quite often it's said that the issues that beset the police, particularly regarding governance and operations, weren't replicated in the fire service. And whilst there's an awful lot to be positive about in the fire service, certainly the view of the FBU is that there's further work to be done. For instance, 5 years to standardise terms and conditions, including the arrangements for flood work, I think indicates that everything hasn't gone as smoothly there. And when I read from a brief that indeed they've recirculated that they provided to the Justice Committee previously, we're willing to negotiate on expanding the role of firefighters as long as this is negotiated in good faith. Now, there's no point in rehearsing some of the problems there were before, but I think that's key to progressing things, that people have trust in engaging. And much has been made of the challenges of the proportion of the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service that relies on the retained service, but we've also heard that it's largely social changes that have meant that it's been difficult to recruit people. So I think that it's important to have the trade unions on board in that. And I would say in relation, and this is particularly in relation to my own part of the world, the Highlands and Islands there, the enhancements to the training facilities in the islands, whereby individuals don't have to leave the islands for specialist training, coupled with the recruitment of more middle managers, has been a real boon, and it has helped. With regard to the police service, I want to comment on our section on human rights. When the legislation was going through, initially I was very pleased to have secured an amendment that ensured that the oath sworn by officers was to uphold human rights, and I think that's very important. Now, we heard from Diego Cortes of the Scottish Human Rights, and he told the committee that human rights should be explicit throughout the 2012 Act and Police Scotland's processes and structures, in particular policy and strategic decisions, making operational planning and deployment, training, guidance, investigation, monitoring and scrutiny. Now, there were well-documented challenges regarding that, not least stop and search, and the approach that was taken in relation to that. A nationwide approach for something that was perhaps more localised. I think the inquiry that went into that, and commend the work of John Scott, I thought has brought about a situation which might not be entirely to my liking, but it certainly stabilised a situation. And key to that report was that Mr Scott said that the police service are the frontline defenders of the citizens' human rights. And that's a role that I think they should jealously guard. And although a role that is put under threat by the way they've gone about, for instance, issues like armed policing, and more recently, the situation with cyber kiosks, seen as highly intrusive and done in the face of little evidence. Of course, absolutely of course, the committee, Justice Committee and all its members wish to ensure that the Scottish Police Service has all the resources to tackle organised crime and keep a pace with all the technology that they have access to, but it must be proportionate, and the potential for collateral damage that associated with that proposal, I think, is something that we need to be very aware of. Indeed, we continue to monitor, and may indeed take us to things like facial recognition, and when Police Scotland are asked simple questions about that and disappointingly are unable to answer them. So hopefully we'll get an answer from them today on that. Likewise, the counter-corruption unit, the little-known parts of policing where the intelligence is gathered in a covert way, it's absolutely vital that the integrity of the police service, particularly when it's such a large organisation, isn't brought into question. So the Scottish Human Rights Commission talk about the authority must carry out its functions as well in a proportionate way, and it says they must try to, and of course they would like the words try to removed from the legislation, that the authority must carry out its functions in a proportionate way. And I understand that the Cabinet Secretary, indeed he told the committee that he would meet with the Human Rights Commission to consider its recommendations, and I know he'll engage in that with an open mind. I want to talk about the C word, centralisation, which is often peppered our discussions. And if I may be parochial for a wee minute and say that one of the challenges when you're looking at the legislation is to not get to look at how the legislation has impacted in the operations of the day, and you need a comparator for that. So reflecting back, the single officer station that I used to occupy no longer exists. The section station where the sergeant was no longer exists. 2 other stations in that area no longer exist. That was all centralised. That function was centralised. It wasn't centralised by Police Scotland. It was centralised by Northern Constabulary. Now, that is a situation that is replicated across the country. So I understand when people talk about officer numbers and frontline numbers, Mr Kerr talked about that, it's sometimes difficult to get a baseline for that, because it's not like with like. Because what we do know is that police demands are shaped by the legislation. So, for instance, the domestic violence demands that are placed in the quite correct high regard that Police Scotland have in relation to the way they go about domestic violence and rape crisis, as the Cabinet Secretary said. There's a transformation there, and I've said that in the past, and I'll continue to say it. That is resource intensive, but also the committee visited Forfar Police Station, and we met officers there occupying space that perhaps might have been one time been occupied by uniformed officers. I accept that, but these were providing a function over a wider area, and they were dealing with the pursuit of serial domestic abuse individuals. Very labour intensive, very intelligence intensive, collaboration with the prosecution services and that. So yes, that might mean that there's officers off the street, but that is a very, very important function that's been undertaken. So I think the centralisation, yes, people understand that. Yes, indeed.
Liam Kerr.
I don't necessarily dispute the point, but the member will presumably accept that, that the increased pressure, the increased responsibility on those officers who remain is going to cause them significant challenges, which we have to be aware of.
John Finney.
Indeed, and I was just coming on to that point, Mr Kerr, which is when we've previously heard that, and we heard most recently in the visit to Gala, that if officers were called to a domestic abuse incident in the morning, that would be their entire shift. Now, in a previous visit, we heard that if these 2 officers, uniformed officers, were deployed in that, they would be answering to 5 officers in an office who are doing all this behind-the-scenes stuff. And it's an inevitable consequence of policing that the resource can only come from one place. It is the front line. So I absolutely accept the pressures on the front line. What I'm saying is that has to perhaps be balanced by some of the benefits that comes from these specialist and more widely accepted services. I don't know how long I have, Presiding Officer.
Pardon? I don't know how much the Chamber wants to take from Mr Finney. I'm not putting it to the vote. You can have another minute if you wish.
Thank you very much indeed.
I don't hear anybody sighing, and just, but that's very kind of you to Mr Finney. Go ahead.
It's a good day. It's a good day. Yeah, I think, Presiding Officer, that there will always be challenges. The challenges that exist around the capital budget in relation to the estate, and of course, that consolidation that we're not replicating things, not 8 times, but in many instances 10 times, because there was the 2 central services, means that we have liberated some of these buildings. They have fallen into disrepair. What I would like to see is no reputational damage done to Police Scotland by can we dispose of them quickly. I recently went through a village in the Highlands where the police station is empty. It's been empty for some time. Given the housing lists, it would be very good to ensure that these were disposed of. Likewise, of course we want roadworthy police vehicles, but let's not have some arbitrary figure on a speedometer or some replace them when they need to replace them. That's what we should do, everything, rather than give these fleet companies any more money than they already have. I'll leave it there.
He's left it there.
Right.
Thank you very much. As you can tell, I've got about 15 minutes in hand, so, you know, I can be quite easygoing, which makes a change. Mr MacArthur.
Deputy Presiding Officer, can I start by welcoming James Kelly to his new position. I certainly look forward to working with him on the Justice Committee and on the subcommittee. I can also pay tribute to Daniel Johnson and thank him for the contribution he's made to both of those committees and wish him well in his new post, I think, on the Education Committee. Presiding Officer, like other colleagues, I also want to thank colleagues, clerks, Spice, and all those who give both written and oral evidence during the course of what I think was actually quite a lengthy inquiry. I think John Finney is absolutely right. All too often do we have the opportunity to undertake post-legislative scrutiny, and the fact that we've done it on a bill or an act that is of this importance, and indeed a contentious piece of legislation at that, I think is entirely appropriate. As the Chamber will probably not need reminding, my party consistently opposed the centralisation that lies at the heart of this bill. I think the committee was right to draw a distinction however, between the process in relation to the police force and the process in relation to the fire and rescue services. I think the conclusions reached in that regard were entirely fair. It's not without its challenges, but I think there were a number of benefits that came through that process. I think John Finney, again, was quite right to identify some of the additional investment in facilities in Orkney and other parts of the Highlands and Islands. That has been a long time coming, but very welcome for all that. Scottish Liberal Democrats, though, repeatedly voiced our concerns about the loss of accountability and transparency in policing. We warned of the risks of concentrating power in the hands of a few individuals and moving towards a one-size-fits-all approach to policing. At every stage, the government rejected those concerns, ignored the warnings, and as a result was then slow to act. Take the concerns about a loss of local accountability, dismissed at the time by the then Justice Secretary Kenny McCaskill. Yet, in an interview again at the weekend, Chief Constable Ian Livingston acknowledged the high-handed way in which decisions were taken immediately post-centralisation. There can surely be no question that the so-called Strathclydeisation of policing under Sir Stephen House removed discretion from local officers across the country and undermined the ethos of community policing. Again, contrary to Mr McCaskill's adamant stance, evidence from ASPs during our inquiry bore out the sheer scale and complexity of centralisation, which had been underestimated by government. Yep, certainly.
Cabinet Secretary.
I thank Lee MacArthur for giving way. I appreciate he has to make the points that he's making, but I do think he's fighting battles somewhat of the past. But we agree with the current Chief Constable's assessment that we would not be as safe as we currently are if it wasn't for the reform of the service.
Liam MacArthur.
No, I disagree with that. I think there has been an attempt by the government to look at crime figures generally and the trends of crime figures in Scotland and draw a direct causal link between police reform and the achievement of those outcomes. We're seeing that across the UK. Those trends began before police centralisation. And I think in terms of the specialised policing, which again the committee was quite right in acknowledging was a necessary reform that needed to be made, that sort of concentration of specialised resources did not require the creation of a single police force. The committee visited Norway during the course of our deliberations, and there you've seen a model of policing that hasn't created a single force, but has delivered the specialisms that are necessary in modern policing. But again, it didn't help, of course, that the relationship between Police Scotland and the SPA in the early stages was so dysfunctional, as well as an unedifying spectacle of a very public turf war that fatally compromised effective oversight of what Police Scotland was doing. Dr Malik, in evidence to the committee, said the SPA was mostly reactive and the public accountability of the police was led by the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish press. It didn't help, however, that the Justice Secretary at the time and the government in which he served was so tenured. Public alarm at armed officers being deployed on routine duties was brushed aside as an operational matter. Concerns over industrial levels of stop and search, including of children under the age of 8, were similarly dismissed by the Justice Secretary as scaremongering, as were concerns over the centralisation of call handling and a lack of support for the staff in those centres. In each instance, the Justice Secretary was wrong and subsequently forced to then take action. Though in the case of the call handling, this was not before the tragic events that saw Marabelle and John Yule left for dead at the side of the M9. Of course, we are now told that all these problems are in the past, that things are very different, that the personalities have changed and have ushered in a new, more considered approach. And certainly I accept that Hamza Youssef, Ian Livingston, Susan Deacon are very different in their outlook to that of their predecessors. However, it's not unreasonable to view the assurances offered now in the context of those that were offered in the past. The recent example of the botched merger of the British Transport Police into Police Scotland is a case in point. There was no detailed business case for this. Questions and concerns raised by BTP officers and staff were never properly taken into account, and requests to at least delay, if not abandon the plans, fell on deaf ears. The Cabinet Secretary certainly won't.
John Finney.
Thank you, President Officer. I'm grateful for Mr MacArthur taking an intervention on my point. Given Mr MacArthur's view on civil liberties, does he not share my concern that the police service of 220 officers who can effect arrests, who can enter people's premises, who can crave warrants, has no public accountability? Which
Liam MacArthur.
Police,
I beg your pardon. Liam MacArthur.
I mean, I don't think during any of the evidence that we took that concern was raised either by any of the stakeholders or by the public at large. What we had was a service that was working very, very effectively and that had been, for political reasons, as was made absolutely apparent by the independent inspector, found itself merged into Police Scotland without a detailed business case. But again, that was met with allegations of scaremongering. Meanwhile, the recent issues surrounding the proposed rollout of so-called cyber kiosks exposed the need for Parliament to continue to play a role in robustly scrutinising the decisions being taken by Police Scotland and the oversight performed by SPA. Susan Deakin, for whom I have the utmost respect and who I think is due considerable credit for many of the reforms that she has introduced since taking over as chair of the SPA. However, it was disappointing to hear her call into question the role of Parliament and MSPs at a recent SPA board meeting. On the issue of cyber kiosks, he is reported to have said back in May, quote, "We have now received more correspondence asking even more questions of detail about this particular programme. I really don't think that it is desirable or sustainable." She added that every hour officers and SPA board members spend explaining their decisions to MSPs is an hour when they are not doing their main jobs. I make no apology for the way in which this Parliament, and the Justice Subcommittee in particular, has discharged its responsibilities. The failure to address from the outset fundamental issues around human rights, privacy and transparency in relation to the rollout of cyber kiosks is now recognised by Police Scotland. But that change of heart had nothing to do with any concerns being raised by the SPA, who happily waved through the project unchallenged. I think the public would expect Parliament to continue performing its role and not allow Police Scotland and the SPA to effectively mark their own homework. The other key area where promises and assurances made in the early stages still cast a long shadow is in relation to the budget. As Audit Scotland and indeed witnesses from Police Scotland to Unison have testified, the promised savings and efficiencies from centralisation have generally failed to materialise. As Unison told us, the claims were based on, quote, oversimplistic reasoning. So we have seen 1,700 civilian staff lose their jobs. Buildings and equipment deteriorate to a point where they present a danger to officers and staff, and evidence to the committee at lunchtime today suggesting that this has every likelihood of getting worse. And an IT system that is not fit for purpose and leaves police struggling to perform their duties or keep pace with increasing sophistication of cyber-enabled crime. All of these concerns have been graphically laid bare by the SPF and others over recent months. It has been a focus of the subcommittee's deliberations as well, including earlier today. Yeah, certainly.
I think the member, generous though I am, there are limits, and I think you should be winding up, please. You'll get a little extra time, Ms Mackay, your own speech.
Deputy Presiding Officer, I have great respect for the current Justice Secretary, for the Chief Constable and the SPA Chair. They have undoubtedly made progress in addressing some of the more shambolic consequences of the centralisation of policing. Staff also deserve credit for keeping things going and mitigating as best they can the damaging impact of centralising reforms. But given the police's extraordinary powers as a single national force, the exercising of those powers should be subject to unparalleled scrutiny. Fundamentally, Scottish Liberal Democrats still believe this centralisation, concentrating power in the hands of such a limited number of individuals, is unhealthy, but also unnecessary in meeting the needs of modern policing. And that, Deputy Presiding Officer, is regrettable.
Thank you. And to the open debate, where there is a little generosity, obviously it's ebbing away slightly, I call Fulton McGregor, followed by Gordon Lyndhurst. Mr McGregor, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Presiding Officer. And it's great to hear about your generosity, because usually in this chamber we have to get our speeches right on the minute when you're in the chair, Presiding Officer. It was... No, I do have some time in hand. I'm keeping you informed. Wait, bear with me, sit down. Mr McGregor, sit down a minute. I wouldn't want to disappoint you. Okay. 9.5 minutes in hand. Exciting days. Don't do it, don't do it. Thank you, Presiding Officer, again. It was right as Elizabeth said.
Excuse me, it's not for you. You're not getting 9.5 minutes.
That's all right.
That's for the team in here. Right, thank you.
I understood that. It was right that as a committee we got to undertake post-legislative scrutiny on the Police and Fire Reform Act, and I think everybody today has already said that. And I think it's another example of this Parliament getting on with the day job of scrutiny, where we witnessed the debacle and the assault on democracy happening in London. And it was, after all, a significant change, bringing the 8 legacy forces into one. And it was pleasing to hear through the various evidence sessions that we had witnesses generally talking about positive changes that had happened. For example, Scottish Police Authority Chair Susan Deakin, who did come and make herself available to MSPs for questioning, said reform was absolutely the right direction to go down, and I think the country is better for it. And the public recognise this too, Presiding Officer, that the changes have been positive. For instance, statistics show that a majority of adults believe that police are doing an excellent job in the local area, or excellent job in the local area. And I don't think this can be hard to understand for many MSPs. certainly not myself. The police in my area are very responsive to local issues and always on hand to attend meetings or provide feedback. Even just a couple of weeks ago there, we've been having some issues in Coatbridge Town Centre, and I pulled together a stakeholders meeting. 2 police officers came, attended the whole meeting, reassured residents and others, and were part of the plan that we put together for moving forward. And that's just one small example, and I'm sure MSPs have got examples across the constituencies. And overall of this, since the government first came into power, reported crime has dropped 42%, and people do feel safer. I hear Liam MacArthur's point about the statistics and linking them to the change in police service, but by the same token, I would say there's no evidence to say that these statistics aren't linked to the police service, and maybe others would, yeah.
Daniel Johnson.
I thank the member for giving way, and indeed they're contemporaneous, but those stats are the same throughout the Western world. Is that due to the creation of Police Scotland wherever they've occurred in Europe?
Fulton McGregor.
I don't think that they are the same, and a lot of the stats, for example, compare Scotland with England and Wales. Well, for example, Scottish people have personally experienced less crime than those living in England and Wales, and non-sexual violent crime is at a lowest level in nearly 50 years. So there's just one example to say that. I'm not disputing with Daniel Johnson and Liam MacArthur that perhaps the stats are due to other factors, but what I'm saying is maybe you would need to provide evidence of that as well. And what we might find is it's a combination of both. It could be a combination of factors going on elsewhere and also the changes to the police service. That's not to say, Presiding Officer, there weren't recommendations made for improvement, and as we've heard already from other speakers, there have been further information around budgets, etc., that have came to the fore since the report was published. And it is good to hear the Cabinet Secretary indicate that he will take that on board, in particular our report's recommendations. Presiding Officer, I want to concentrate a wee bit on the police part of the report first. There was strong evidence from a number of witnesses that Police Scotland have benefited greatly from the formation of Police Scotland. By bringing forces together, police have been able to deploy specialist officers across Scotland. The report noted that this was particularly beneficial in some cases, such as for victims of domestic abuse and/or sexual abuse, and providing a consistent approach across the country. And I can't stress enough how powerful this evidence was when we heard it from witnesses. Further, as well as the deployment of specialist officers, the merger has allowed Police Scotland to achieve a higher level of consistency in training. Officers are now trained in various areas, and I do remember, speaking about the B2B integration, I do remember that this was a particular strong point that was raised, that officers would be trained across a number of police roles and functions. And I think it's important as well that we stand up in this chamber and thank the police, because just at the Justice Subcommittee today, during the pre-budget scrutiny, there was a discussion around the sectarian issues in relation to marches over recent weeks. And it's important to remember that our police force have to respond to this without any prior warning, and respond and deploy officers on the ground to keep us all safe. And this includes these type of incidents, but also other matters. And I think that, you know, we must thank police officers, but I'd also urge the government to take these situations into account when factoring in budgeting, and that was something that's just freshly discussed at the Justice Subcommittee an hour or two ago. Presiding Officer, I'll move on now to talk a wee bit about the Fire and Rescue Service part of the report. Again, generally speaking, the establishment of the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service has been widely regarded as a success. Audit Scotland, as the convener also said, noted in 2015 that the consolidation of the 8 services were managed effectively, and the movement to a single national body has enhanced the scrutiny placed upon it, thus increasing its performance and effectiveness. However, it is important that we learn lessons where we can and reflect on criticisms. Members will be aware, and some have already referred to it, that the Fires Brigade Union have been vocal about the views of the Justice Committee report. The FBU have challenged the assertion that the 2012 Act has been unambiguously good for Scotland. The FBU have noted that although there has been a recent upturn, the overall number of firefighters has decreased since the Act was passed. And perhaps worryingly, the FBU have also recognised that Scottish Fire and Rescue Services does not compare favourably to other UK nations regarding gender diversity. Cuts in recruitment and an apparent lack of funding, as noted by their report, have led to some discontent amongst firefighters. And I think that we must take that on board and consider it when we're moving forward. And I do have some experience with this directly. Presiding officer, my own office being only a few hundred yards from Coatbridge Fire Station, or locally referred to as Coatdyke Fire Station. And over the years since my election, several officers there, who also happen to be constituents, have spoken to me about concerns in changes in staffing, shift patterns and the number of appliances on. They have raised concerns of unease amongst the staff team and real worries that several fires in any one night might cause, across a huge geographic region, could stretch the service too far. And I think this point has been raised by others, Presiding Officer, because I can see you signalling me. To be fair, Chief Officers have always given me robust reassurance in this, but as MSPs I feel it's our duty to recognise when there's disparity between what management say and what those on the ground are saying, and this goes for services anywhere. So I would ask that the Government consider this and possibly even organise another visit to Coatdyke Fire Station, because the previous Minister had done that, and I know that that went down very, very well. Presiding Officer, our police and fire service do a fantastic job.
No, you've misunderstood. It wasn't 9.5 minutes just to you.
It was only summing up.
Just conclude. It's a wonderful speech.
Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Down. Thank you. I call Gordon Lyndhurst, be followed by Jenny Gilruth.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. We all owe a huge debt to our emergency services and all of those, including the police, who stand ready at all hours and in all circumstances to come to the aid of others who need it. They are a huge credit to our country, and like others already, I would like to say that that's something we should never lose sight of when we're discussing the police or emergency services in our country. Coming to today's debate, some 7 years after this Act came into force, we should of course look carefully at whether the promises made when the legislation was passed have been fulfilled. And there are areas of concern, some of which arise as a direct result of lack of funding, forethought and long-term strategy. The Scottish Police Authority has reported in March that the force will face a mammoth £56 million funding gap across the next financial year. This has been compounded by Police Scotland's warning earlier this week that they will require £70 million in further funding in the next financial year simply to maintain their current level of service. I'm sure that the Cabinet Secretary would agree that continuing gaps in funding will and would undermine the stated intention that the measures taken in 2012 were to make the emergency services more financially viable. Certainly.
Cabinet Secretary.
I thank the member for giving me. I'm not disagreeing with his points around financial stability. He will accept two things, I'm sure. One, some of that instability is caused because of the recent political events, and there's no doubt about that, because Police Scotland have had to increase the number of police officers to deal with a no-deal Brexit potentially. But the second point is that where there is a deficit, the Scottish Government, of course, are the ones who will fund that deficit. So while there might be uncertainty, while there might be a deficit, what we'll try to do is always provide Police Scotland, and we have done over the years, certainty that that deficit will no way mean that they will have to make drastic cuts to officer numbers or indeed any other part of the service.
Gordon Lyndhurst.
Well, I do accept, of course, that there are changing circumstances that any government or police force has to respond to. But I do think that that doesn't fully answer the point, because, for example, with the Prime Minister promising funding for 20,000 more police officers, there will be direct Barnett consequentials for Scotland of that. And is the Cabinet Secretary willing to commit this funding directly to our police force in Scotland to address the funding gap here? That's a question he may wish to come back to. Issues of funding and numbers have, of course, been mirrored across the police and fire services, as has already been referred to, with the Fire Brigade Union telling us last week that there are now over 900 fewer firefighters than a decade ago. And those who remain have experienced a real terms pay cut. The police service shows a similarly gloomy picture, with 7 of the 13 divisions across Scotland reporting a drop in frontline divisional officers since Police Scotland was created in 2013. And the systems that our services require to work with continue to be inadequate. Chief Constable Ian Livingston, amongst others, has described current IT systems as akin to an analogue world. The Scottish Government's failed I6 programme lost the unified force almost £200 million in promised savings. As a result, the Police Federation itself told the committee in its written submission that, and I quote, "preventative work is considered a luxury it can scarcely afford." So if we just think about these things, we could improve our police presence in our communities across Scotland, including Edinburgh and Lothian, to a great extent if we had proper operating systems in place to back up our police officers. It is said, yes.
John Finney.
I agree with his last point. I wonder would he join me in welcoming the rollout of the digital devices, which will mean that officers will be able to do work when out, rather than perhaps have to queue up at an outdated machine back at their office.
Gordon Lyndhurst.
The member, I'm sure, I would join with them in welcoming any improvements in the equipment or services that police have at their disposal. I mean, they no longer, for example, have to run to the nearest blue police box to place a call. And clearly, technology and technological improvements are important in ensuring that police officers can do their job well and in terms of the efficiency of our police forces. So as a generality, certainly, yes, I do agree with them on that point and on that sort of principle in terms of approach. But that, again, does not deal with some of the issues that I've been raising here. And the problem is the perception in our communities, the awareness of police presence in communities, I understand, has fallen from 56% when Police Scotland was created to just 40% in 2017 to 18. Ultimately, too, total crime in Scotland is still on the rise, and 2/3 of crime continues to go unreported, a figure that has not changed in over a decade. The benefits of reform, in the words of Unison police staff, have been grossly embellished. So it is difficult to see how the change has helped to deliver, in every area, more effective emergency services across Scotland. So I think the Cabinet Secretary should accept that centralisation has made our communities feel that there's less of a police presence in the streets. And even the new Chief Constable accepted that Police Scotland was too centralised at the start, that it didn't listen to communities, and that they are now trying to move away from the one-size-fits-all approach, and that, of course, is welcome. I don't know how much time I'm allowed to use of the 9.5 minutes.
Up to 7 minutes, please.
Up to 7 minutes. Thank you. There are also another number of issues which I won't go into detail in light of the restricted time. For example, the complaints investigation and handling procedures which have been highlighted, described as both inadequate and confusing, with 9 different bodies, a variety of internal, external processes involved in the handling of any one complaint, resulting in what the report has described as a disproportionate impact on the effectiveness and morale of the service itself. Other problems with procedures, ambiguous definitions of what characterises simple misconduct or gross misconduct, what Commissioner Kate Frame of the PERC identified as, for example, the inappropriate recording of complaints. So there's quite a number of issues that have been identified as needing address, and I'm sure the Cabinet Secretary will want to address these and indicate how he will try to do so going forward in his closing remarks. And I will conclude there.
Thank you very much, Mr Lyndhurst. I call Jenny Gilruth to be followed by Daniel Johnson. Ms Gilruth.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And can I add my thanks on the record to the Justice Committee clerks for all their help and support in pulling together the committee's report on police and fire reform, and of course to the witnesses who gave evidence and the submissions that we received. In 2012, Barack Obama was re-elected as the President of the USA. London held the Olympics. I was still in my 20s. 2012 was not yesterday. 7 years ago, reforming the previous 8 legacy police forces into a singular national force was a transformation in terms of how we deliver public services. But as we've heard today, it did not come without its challenges. The context of reform, as acknowledged by the report, was the predicted fall in real terms of the Scottish Government's real terms budget. Indeed, as the report notes, the Government consistently stated that maintaining 8 police forces was unsustainable and that without structural reform, smaller forces in particular would be vulnerable to cuts in frontline services. Additionally, changes to the perceived traditional role of policing and accountability concerns highlighted by HMICS compounded the case for reform. There were undoubtedly challenges in the first few years, particularly between the role of the Scottish Police Authority and Police Scotland, as Liam Kerr mentioned. However, the committee heard evidence from the SPA's chair, Susan Deakin, that a number of measures had been implemented since her appointment. And as the convener mentioned, these included improvements to governance and scrutiny arrangements, an increase in SPA staff numbers, and work to strengthen the board structure within the organisation. As such, the committee recommended that HMICS instruct an evaluation of these changes to ensure that these had been appropriately addressed. The policy memorandum for the original bill referenced an extra 1,000 police officers to meet the Scottish Government's commitment to maintain police officer numbers at 17,234.65. The most recent publication of police numbers in June of this year confirms that there are currently 17,259.306 police officers nationally. Police Scotland made clear in their submission to the committee that prior to the 2012 Act, access to specialist resources across the legacy forces was inconsistent. And as such, Police Scotland stated that there is now a more consistent access across the country, and that has been particularly compelling in relation to crimes of a sexual nature. The latest national statistics show that 60% of sexual crime and 76.1% of violent crime were cleared up in 2017-18. Rape Crisis Scotland commented, as highlighted by the Cabinet Secretary, in our experience, the move to a single police force has transformed the way rape and other sexual crimes are investigated in Scotland. It has allowed far greater consistency of approach, including the training of police officers and the use of specialist officers. The Chief Executive, Sandy Brindley, added that this could be improved further if issues with attitudes, training and culture within policing were addressed. And on this point, I think it would be helpful in summing up if the Cabinet Secretary could perhaps respond to Ms Brindley's point, as I know that tackling sexual violence is a priority for the Government. The Act also aimed to avoid duplication of police work whilst protecting frontline police officer numbers. And as Police Scotland noted in their evidence to the committee, the frontline has been protected as a result of the 2012 Act, with most police officers in local policing based within our communities and supported by national specialist resources. Everyone in Scotland now has access to an improved level of service and protection, balanced between equal access to specialist national resources and local policing that meets the needs of our geographically diverse communities, whether they be remote, rural, urban or island. And this evidence has been supported anecdotally by the committee's visits, most recently to the Scottish Borders and Galashiels, which the convener mentioned, and last year to Angus, which John Finney mentioned, where officers confirmed directly with members of the committee that they had greater access to nationally available specialist resources, such as the use of the police helicopter in missing persons cases. The committee also heard strong examples of partnership working, such as the Missing Persons Framework, the Mental Health Strategy and the Suicide Prevention Strategy, all of which were cited as examples of greater consistency in working practices. In June 2018, the previous Cabinet Secretary announced an independent review into the police complaints process. The interim report published in June of this year, and one of the key recommendations provided was that complaints involving senior officers should be dealt with more quickly, which I'm sure fellow committee members welcomed. Indeed, as the committee reported, Police Scotland and the Scottish Police Authority both have a non-statutory deadline of 56 days to investigate and conclude complaints, which is often not met. And as such, the committee recommended introducing a set time for Police Scotland and the SPA to acknowledge receipt of complaints, to inform officers who are the subject of complaints, and for witnesses to be interviewed following receipt of a complaint. It was therefore also welcoming to note in the interim report the recommendation that officers should be made aware that they are the subject of a complaint against them at the earliest practicable point. Presiding Officer, the creation of Police Scotland did not come without its challenges. 8 legacy forces with 8 very different ways of doing things. Notwithstanding, greater consistency has been delivered nationally, particularly when dealing with crimes of a sexual nature. Specialist resources are now being shared at a local level. Police officer numbers have been protected. There will continue to be challenges for the organisation, as across the public sector we witness the impact of an austerity agenda squeezing our public services. But to reflect on our current politics in closing, in recent days we have witnessed the Conservative Government reverse its policy on convergence uplift payments for Scottish farmers, and yesterday a welcome climb down in terms of the post-study visas. A cynic might say that there's an election in the offing. Liam Kerr, who is not in the chamber, has a bit of cheek, I would have to say, to mention the SNP's record in terms of our police funding. Not a peep from the Tory benches today about the £125 million already paid to the UK Treasury. And can I say to James Kelly that Labour's policy on this is probably about as clear as their policy on Brexit. Presiding officer, our officers in Scotland have helped to contribute to a hefty Boris bonus. It is depressingly predictable that yet again not a single Conservative member can stand and be counted and argue for that money to be rightly returned to the communities our officers help to keep safe every day. Policing in Scotland has successfully reformed. Perhaps it's time the Scottish Tories followed suit. Thank you.
I say to the three gentlemen that triangular conversations aren't very polite when somebody's speaking. Thank you. And I now call Daniel Johnson to be followed by Shona Robison.
Well, can I begin with an apology, presiding officer? But in addition to the usual thanks to the committee and the clerks, can I extend a particular thanks to colleagues on the Justice Committee? I've hugely enjoyed my time on it. And I think looking at the matters around justice, but in particular criminal justice, I've left with one conclusion, which is that in many ways the issues that you deal with in criminal justice span the vast swathe of public services, because the issues that you deal with in criminal justice are where those services fail. It's those failures which result in people coming into contact with the criminal justice system, and that's what makes them, in some senses, the most fundamental issues that you can examine across public policy. But it's also instilled in me a huge admiration for the police and police officers. They do an outstanding job, putting themselves in harm's way to keep us safe. So whatever issues we may bring up in terms of police reform, be under no illusion, is that it is all said with that admiration for the work that they do. So I think we do need to look at the demands we place on our police. If I was to be blunt, I think in some ways the issue with SNP police policy is that it's been focused on two crude measures. One, creating a single police force, and secondly, 1,000 extra police officers. Because the brutal reality is this, that every administration since 1970 can claim to have increased police officer numbers by at least 1,000. From Heath onwards, that has been the true. And so that leaves us with a conundrum. If we are to believe that we have lowest levels of crime that we've seen in 30 years, but we have the highest ever level of police officers, why then do we have the overstretch faced by police officers? And that is certainly real. Most recently, when we visited a police station in Galashiels, we were struck by how tidy and neat their mess room was. And the brutal reality as to why it was so neat and tidy is because police officers don't often get the opportunity to use it. So why is it that we have such a high level of police officers, but such overstretch? And in part, that is about the changing nature of crime, such as online crime. We're also dealing with things differently. We have new sensitivities and thoroughness of approach, where in the past we'd have used old-fashioned, blunt approaches. But the reality is that we've had a fixation on those two numbers, creating a single force, and with 1,000 extra police officers, there's other numbers which have been ignored. While the Cabinet Secretary did indeed point to the increase of capital funding in the most recent budget, the brutal reality is that we have the 5th worst capital funding of any police force per employee in the United Kingdom. It would need to be almost doubled to meet the average. We would need to be increased 5-fold to meet the level of capital funding per employee that Metropolitan Police has. And what that results in is a lack of investment in systems and in IT that the police need in order to do their job in this new challenging circumstances and with the single police force. Because this is the cruel irony of the creation of the single police force, is that what it was meant to be about was freeing officers up by creating a single set of core functions which would allow police officers to do their job rather than being caught up in centralised bureaucracy. But what it has resulted in is police officers being used to backfill civilian roles, centralisation of officers in central units, and a reduction of response officers. And while I freely admit it is important to have specialised officers, at that point of contact, that point of need on the ground, officers are now forced to go running from call to call, pulled from pillar to post, rather than dealing with people and the everyday situations they have in their communities, which is where they would need to be. And indeed, I think Brexit is now creating something of a crunch point for our police. They need to reduce their number of officers by 700, according to Will Kerr, with a deficit of £35.7 million. That, quite simply, should be a wake-up call to us all, not just in terms of those figures, but the fact, actually, that the police themselves feel the need to speak up publicly about it, something that they think they do with reticence. So the reality is this, is that the police force needed investment to make a success of it. And the truth is, 5 years in, that investment still has not occurred. We still have 8 different crime reporting systems, and the police have only just in the recent weeks and months got a single sign-on so that they don't have multiple logins to access their emails depending on what part of the country you're in. That's not acceptable for any 21st century organisation. But the issues go beyond simply those of investment. The structure and governance of the single force were a point of contention through the passage of the bill, and I think history has borne out many of those concerns. From local accountability, and I think Liam McCarthy, who I know is no longer in the chamber, was right to point out many of the issues that occurred when we saw a Strathclydeisation of our police. And indeed, the irony for people in this part of the country was that that led to the breakup of the housebreaking teams, only for them to have to be reinstated when that policy failed. Others have mentioned the complaints procedure, but I would just like to mention it briefly in passing. It is simply far too complicated, and it undermines confidence that people have in the police, not least because, for many people, the first port of call is to report complaints directly to the very body that they have issue with in the first place. And so I do hope that Dame Eilish Angelini's review addresses that. But the key and central issue with governance, I think, was demonstrated with the issue around the departure of Phil Gormley as the previous Chief Constable. And while the people may have changed around the SPA, the central issues have not been dealt with. There are still issues in terms of the powers of appointment and direction that the government have. Now, with that particular decision, it was perhaps the right decision. It perhaps was the right thing to do to ensure that Phil Gormley stayed on suspension. But the way that decision was made was wholly inadequate. Because if the chair of the SPA did have no other option, I find it difficult to understand how that was anything other than a direction. And yet, the way that should have been dealt with, put before Parliament, simply did not happen. Until that is addressed, until those issues around that relationship between government and the police is resolved, we will continue to have an issue around the governance of our police. And that could be dealt with through greater transparency, explicit protocols, as happens with other forces, in ways that I have raised previously in Parliament. Ultimately, and in conclusion, while I think we all support the police force, this is a model of how not to undertake transformation. It could have been done differently, and we still need the investment to make a success of the single force that we all want to see. Thank you.
Shona Robertson, followed by Oliver Mundell.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. May I begin by thanking my fellow members of the committee for their contributions during our deliberations in the lead-up and input into the final content of the report. And I wish Daniel Johnson well in his new committee. I think he's been a thoughtful contributor to the Justice Committee and has just delivered yet another thoughtful speech here today. I think he'll be missed. I'd also like to thank the clerks and support staff for all the work they've done in the collation and publication of the report. Without doubt, as has been said already, the creation of Police Scotland and the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service was and is the biggest reform of the police and fire services since the Parliament's inception. In fact, it's probably the biggest reform of the public sector, public services that we have seen over the 20 years of this Parliament. It has been challenging, but progress has undoubtedly been made. It's worth remembering and reiterating what the three main policy intentions in promoting the 2012 Act were, firstly, to protect and improve local services despite financial cuts, to create more equal access to specialist support and national capacity, and to strengthen the connection between services and communities. Therefore, the committee's remit primarily covered scrutinising whether the policy intentions of the 2012 Act have been realised and are being delivered. In the report, it was noted, and it's worth reminding the Chamber and putting it on the record, that one of the major drivers of reform of the police service was, of course, the reduction in the Scottish Block Grant, which the Scottish Government estimated would reduce by £3.3 billion in real terms between 2012 and 2016. It was recognised that in the face of cuts coming from Westminster, it was essential to protect frontline delivery. And, of course, that is indeed what the Scottish Government has done. And my colleague Jenny Gilruth highlighted the fact that frontline policing numbers have been maintained. So it is worth pointing out at this point to Gordon Lyndhurst that is in stark contrast, of course, to what we've seen elsewhere. In the last 9 years, police numbers have decreased in England and Wales by 14.8%. Indeed, the number of officers in England and Wales is at its lowest since directly comparable records began in 1996. So I think it's fair to say that although things might not have been perfect, when they stand in stark contrast to the shambles down south, and indeed to the legitimate community concerns raised regularly by those representing communities down south. It's worth remembering that. It was also noted that reform of the police service was proposed in order to respond to the changing nature of policing in a 21st century society, and in response to the discussion paper produced by Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary in Scotland, which described the development of the system of police governance over the previous 50 years, and what it called the weaknesses in police governance and accountability, which has perpetrated since the 1962 Royal Commission, and which it is contended must be addressed in support of any future model of policing in Scotland. The Scottish Government indicated that the new governance arrangements proposed in the Police and Fire Reform Scotland Bill would respond to the weaknesses identified in the discussion paper. Therefore, for many very practical reasons, reform was essential. And of course, the legislation finally was enacted in 2012. 7 years on, the Act has been evaluated through a 4-year programme established by the Scottish Government, which began work in 2015 and has so far published 3 evaluation reports, with a 4th currently underway. The 3rd report concluded that the evidence suggested that the first 2 policy aims of reform had largely been achieved, but that the 3rd policy aim, whilst viewed as a high priority, is the hardest to achieve, and I think that's a fair assessment. And these findings are, of course, echoed by the committee's own findings. To quote briefly from the report, that Police Scotland has successfully reduced duplication of its support services and maintained the police service despite significant financial constraints, that the creation of a single police service has achieved the policy objective of providing more equal access to specialist support, most notably improving Police Scotland's approach to the investigation of sexual crimes and domestic abuse. And of course, we've heard very, very powerful evidence from organisations like Scottish Women's Aid and Rape Crisis Scotland that absolutely back up that assessment. And of course, the committee did note that it would be concerned if there was any unintended consequences, such as officers from local areas being redeployed and not replaced. And of course, the committee has invited the Cabinet Secretary for Justice to respond directly to that issue. With regards to the 3rd main policy intention of the bill to strengthen the connection between services and communities, the committee has found that there were clearly issues with Police Scotland engaging effectively with local authorities in the early days of reform, And I think there's an acknowledgement that this has improved. And as the committee has been out and about, I think certainly the feedback has been that matters have improved, particularly over the last 12 to 18 months. And I think, again, that is a fair assessment of matters to date. The committee also welcomes, of course, the commitment by the Chief Constable to include local scrutiny bodies earlier in the decision-making process. And I think, again, that is something to be welcomed. So, in conclusion, Presiding Officer, undertaking public sector reform is never easy. And, you know, there are 101 reasons sometimes not to do something. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. And sometimes not everything is perfect in the process of doing it. But I certainly am struck by the performance of Police Scotland, whether that's in its detection of and solving of murder cases, in the huge improvement in the investigation of sexual offences, in the revolution, I guess, of support for victims of domestic abuse compared to what, unfortunately, was a very poor experience of too many women previously under the legacy forces. So it's not perfect, but without doubt it is better, and matters are improving on some of the weaknesses that had been identified over the piece, not least in the position of governance. I think Police Scotland compares very well, not just with forces in England and Wales, but most importantly on the international arena. I think Police Scotland should be commended, and particularly the police officers particularly should be commended for the work that they do.
The last of the open debate contributions is from Oliver Mundell.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As a former member of the Justice Committee in what now seems like the dim and distant past, I'm pleased to have the opportunity to speak in this important debate. And I'm actually glad for once as well to be speaking towards the end of the debate, because I think it's been interesting to listen and actually follow the kind of pattern of contributions, because I think it is fair to say the verdict on the new police force in particular, but also the fire service, it is mixed. And I know that whilst I'm sure my constituents so close to the border will be pleased that the SNP have got such a keen eye on what's happening in England, I do think they will struggle still to understand why some of the bad decisions were made at the start, which I'll come to later in my speech. And I'm going to express a kind of personal remark, because obviously this legislation came about long before I was elected, and actually I find myself still agreeing with the Liberal Democrats, and I note that Liam MacArthur's not in the chamber to hear that, but I do think there would have been other ways of achieving the same outcomes without going through so much disruption at such a rapid pace. I want to say at this point that I'm extremely grateful to the Justice Committee for all the hard work they do on behalf of the whole Parliament when it comes to providing the much needed and continuous scrutiny in this area. And I think whatever the ongoing issues, my experience locally has been that, albeit slowly, political and public interest in the job that our police and fire service do has kept up the pressure and delivered significant changes in how frontline services operate under the new structures. I do feel many of the concerns have now been picked up and are being listened to, but there continue to be concerns. Recently I've heard that frontline police officers are no longer going to be available to local media to answer questions, and instead they're going to be directed back to a national service again. I don't think that that necessarily provides the accountability people would look for, and I understand the need as an organisation to have a central media handling team, but I think... Yep.
Hamza Yousaf.
To thank Oliver Mundell for giving way in. I see his concerns obviously are very sincere. Would he agree with me, though, that these are issues, of course, for this debate, but more so for the operational independence of the Chief Constable?
Oliver Mundell.
I'm pleased the Cabinet Secretary for intervening, and I'm pleased to hear him make that point in one sense, because I don't think that these are decisions for politicians. But I also think it highlights another problem which I was going to come to at the end of my speech, is I think when things are not quite as they should be, when things are not as the public would expect, when there's issues around transparency, or when things don't work as envisaged, it's always operational matters. And when credits to be claimed for falling crime and other bits and pieces, politicians are always very keen to step in at that point. And I think we've got to take a balanced approach. And I think when it comes to ensuring transparency, to ensuring that our police service is accountable to people, to our constituents, we do have a job to play in raising concerns about what's happening operationally. And I think that there's a balance to be struck between the two. Locally, I would want to play pay significant tribute to the officers who work on the front line in Dumfries and Galloway within both the fire service and police service, because they have worked very, very hard to make the best of the single force and service, even where they've had personal reservations. And I know that many of my constituents have greatly valued the efforts that many serving locally have gone to fight for the flexibility that's required to ensure that the positive local and community focus in Dumfries and Galloway, which is so highly regarded, has been able to be retained. This has often required significant pushback and resistance to institutional cultures imported from other parts of the country, which I think we've heard from several contributors today, and a perceived pressure to homogenise the services. And I think that is one of the issues. A lot of how the public feel around policing is about perception, and I think that's where more careful handling would work. And I think we've heard the Minister say earlier that these are fighting the battles of the past, but the problem is these decisions live on in our communities, and people were left with a very sour taste at the beginning of this process because there was a failure to recognise that not all parts of Scotland are the same, and that strategies that work well in one area or community might not be appropriate in another. And I think that's where many of the problems we've seen since have stemmed from. I think there was also a particular feeling within the police service that local knowledge and community engagement wasn't recognised at a national level as being important. And I'm pleased to say that some of this is changing. And I do credit Chief Superintendent Linda Jones and her predecessor, Gary Ritchie, for restoring insofar as resources have allowed the appropriate systems and community-style policing that have proved so successful in tight-knit and largely rural communities for generations, where people feel the value of the police presence and want to work closely with them and see them as an integral part of their community. And in that light, I'm particularly pleased to see that they've adopted voluntary opportunities for young people interested in policing in recent months. And I think that that will secure the legacy of the old legacy force in Dumfries and Galloway as we continue to make the best of a new model. Thank you.
Now move to the closing speeches, and it's disappointing to note that not all the opening speakers are present in the chamber for these to begin. And I call on James Kelly for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. I think it's been a really useful debate, and the range of topics covered by members and their contributions show the breadth of work that was undertaken by the committee in looking at both of these reports. I reiterate what I said at the start, that I think post-legislative scrutiny is something that's, you know, we just don't find it, as John Finney said, we just don't find enough time to do it in the Parliament, and I think it's an important task, and we should reflect on that as MSPs. I want, as others have done, to pay tribute to Daniel Johnson for his time in the Justice Committee. Daniel's gone from strength to strength after being elected as an MSP in 2016, and he's got those twin qualities of being able to be robust and hold the ministers to account, but also he can work in a constructive and consensual manner, and I think that's why he was so respected across the committee, and I'm sure he'll continue to do well and make a mark going forward. I think there was a number of interesting issues raised during the course of the debate. Daniel Johnson himself was right to make the point about the capital budget. It has, the government would point out, grown to 35 million in the current budget settlement. However, 88 million alone is required in terms of ICT developments, so there's clearly a shortfall there, and that's something that's going to have to be addressed. John Finney, I think, made some interesting points about human rights, something that's often overlooked. I think the Police Scotland would do well to take those points on board, particularly the points made by the Human Rights Commission and also Unison Scotland about having an independent human rights advisor and also training of officers in regard to human rights. I think it's an issue that's, forces have taken, both in Scotland and internationally, have taken a greater interest in recent years. But I think the work that the committee's done with regard to that is important. Both Shona Robson and Liam Kerr made the point about one of the original aims of the 2012 Act was to strengthen the link between the service and local access to communities. In fact, Oliver Mundell's just been talking about that, how the importance in a local area of people being able to see their police officers out and about. In fact, in terms of community officers, I know in the area I represent, they play a crucial role in having links with local community groups. And this objective of improving the local links is clearly one that there's been attention around as the legislation's been implemented. Callum Steele made the point that he felt that in terms of when there were budgetary strains, that the local resources were the ones that sometimes were sacrificed. And I think we've got to get the balance right more in terms of that. The example that Daniel Johnson quoted about the disbandment of housebreaking teams in Edinburgh is one where a good local initiative was compromised. I think Liam Kerr made a very valid point about taking international examples on board. We're still going through a process of change here, and the committee have obviously visited Norway, where they seem to have taken some valid points on board because they've gone through a process of reform over there, and I think it's important to continue to learn. Gordon Lyndhurst made the point about the funding gap in terms of budgets, and that from the evidence that Police Scotland have given, the discussions at the committee, that's clearly a challenge, and it's going to be an issue in the coming budget round. We heard the Cabinet Secretary acknowledge the discussions he was going to have in terms of that budget setting process. Both Jenny Gilruth and Margaret Mitchell spoke about the police complaints process. I think that's quite an important point, and I know from casework that I've dealt with over the years that there is an element of frustration about when complaints are brought both by the public and by serving police officers about the way that those complaints are dealt with. They quite often they take longer than expected. There's a lack of transparency around them. So I think I welcome the review that's taking place with Dame Eilish Angelina, and I think that's a very important review because that's an area that clearly there are a lot of concerns on. So in summing up, Deputy Presiding Officer, what I would say is that the reports and the debate that we've had today clearly indicate that there's much still to be done to achieve the objectives of the 2012 Act. There are three particular areas that I think the government need to take into account. If the police and both the fire service are going to be able to service the policy objectives that were set out in that Act, then they need to be properly funded. I think there needs to be proper local accountability and local input. And the local communities have to have confidence that the local operations are serving the objectives of their area. And I think there have been issues around governance with the SPA and also the role of Scottish ministers, and those need to be clarified and tidied up on. So I think it's been a very useful exercise, both that the Justice Committee have conducted and the debate we've had today to bring some of the issues out into the open. And I'm sure the Cabinet Secretary will take many of the points on board.
And now call Maurice Corrie for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I'm too pleased to close for the Scottish Services in this very important debate about the Justice Committee post-legislative scrutiny report on the Fire and Police Reform Act 2012. And I will deal mainly with aspects of IT in the committee report. But I too thank our police and fire and rescue services for keeping us all safe and appreciate all the work which they do, sometimes in the most difficult of circumstances. I'd like to join my colleagues in welcoming the work of the Justice Committee on this report and the excellent work of the committee clerk's team. The committee's scrutiny of the Police and Fire Reform Act goes a long way to show what improvements may be working 5 years later, but it also opens wide the areas in which progress in practice could be better achieved. We must not forget that our police, and I quote John Finney, who so eloquently said that today, rightly stated that they are our frontline defenders of our citizens. We have heard of the original motivations behind these proposed changes to the police and fire services. Both services face considerable financial cuts to their budgets, but arguably needed a more sustainable, streamlined way of operating without duplicate forces. And to deliver this transformation, the bill was to bring in an equality of access, a strengthened link between services and communities, and an improvement on local frontline work. But on the whole, this bill has not gone far enough to achieve lasting efficiency. Of course, improvements have been made, and we can see in the committee's findings as such. A single police force has encouraged a greater emphasis on national units, meaning crimes such as rape and sexual assault can be better investigated on the whole. And moreover, the approach in investigation of murders and unexplained deaths have also seen a marked improvement. In regard to the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service, we have heard that in the face of significant reform, all 356 stations have continued to operate well. But such an overhaul has created some unintended issues that are in clear need of long-term solutions through adequate funding. And we must keep our fire officers and our police officers and fire and rescue personnel safe. My colleagues here have brought to light the worrying lack of a modern IT system, which was referred to recently by Chief Constable Ian Livingston, who stated that IT capability was poor in Police Scotland. We cannot expect to have an efficient and streamlined police force where officers are hindered by the incapability of their own IT system, where at present police officers at the moment cannot even connect into the IT system of another force's area if they're out of their own area. The fact that a new strategy has been partially funded by the Scottish Government is a concerning oversight. As the Vice Chair of the Police Federation, Scottish Police Federation said last year, the wastage in time and efficiency is staggering. And without the proper financial investment into IT services, this could have a detrimental effect on the ability of police officers to carry out their duties as swiftly as possible, where police officers in some cases have even been sent to the wrong addresses. Indeed, both the Scottish Police Authority and Police Scotland have raised concerns that the draft budget of 2019-20 does not allow for a full implementation of an ICT strategy. A key aim of the bill is to remove the issue of duplication, and I'm not alone when I suggest this cannot be achieved without a national and updated ICT system. Of course, the recent rollout of digital notebooks this summer in places such as Dundee and Kinross is a step forward in the right direction. But the Scottish Government must go much further in its funding of a new and updated IT strategy which optimises the police officers' time. The lack of government funding into vital resources for both services significantly limits their ability to serve the public. And for instance, challenges in funding equipment and training for firefighters is an ongoing concern. And without transformative financial investment, fire vehicle and station repairs cannot carry on. Clarity is what is needed, and clear understanding of what the long-term financial plan of the FRCS is. And for the sake of firefighters on the ground, we need to know exactly what financial investment will be planned for its vehicles, equipment and property. Further issues have been raised with policing resources, and evidence came to light of the poor condition of some police stations such as Knockgilphead and Oban in the west of Scotland. Of particular concern to me was to read of the Clydebank Rape and Domestic Abuse Unit in my own region, where we have a staff of 10 and only have 2 cars to share between them, and probably the mileage is pretty high. Surely, such reform as this needs to be accompanied by effective resource funding. And with this, we could have police and fire services that operate to their utmost capability. And my colleague Margaret Mitchell raised the serious issue of police officers backfilling police staff roles. As the committee rightly found, this takes away vital numbers from frontline policing, and this must obviously be minimised. With violent crime on the rise, local and visible policing in our communities needs to be in place. And in respect to the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service, a reduction in frontline firefighters' jobs has meant that communities have not been able to benefit from the reforms as much as possible. If issues surrounding firefighter recruitment and retention can be addressed, I believe that this could easily be transformed in the way the bill intends. And I realise that there are issues in the more rural areas. At the centre of these changes, it is paramount to bear in mind the impact of this legislation on the mental well-being of police officers and firefighters, and something which the committee report shed light on. With a reduction in numbers across both services, responders are dealing with a heavier workload, longer shifts, and an underlying frustration that they are unable to respond to incidents as quickly as they would like. Less managerial posts in the fire service has resulted in the stress and overwork in some cases, as the committee evidence has shown. Scotland's police and fire services, which includes special constables and retained firemen and women, want to serve their local communities as best as they possibly can. But the effect of those people, the effect of these momentous changes on the workload and as a result of mental health must be taken into account. And I conclude at that point. Thank you.
I call Hamza Yousaf. 7 minutes, please, Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In my opening remarks, I concentrated a fair bit on some of the challenges, but also the achievements of the police, and I'll come back to that in a second. But I wanted to start the opening of my closing remarks, as it was, if I could focus on some of the great success of Scottish Fire and Rescue Service. You know, they haven't been mentioned as much. We all have mentioned SFRS in our speeches and our contributions, but they haven't been mentioned as much. And that partly, I think, is because they are, in some respects, a victim of their own success when it has come to reform. Understandably, in the job of scrutiny, both opposition, but even, of course, in government, we reflect on where the challenges often are. How do we improve? How do we ensure the service moves on to the next level of transformation? And, of course, there have been challenges with SFRS, but I think it's widely recognised that if you wanted to look at a model of public sector reform, the achievements of SFRS as a single service are really a great model for others to follow. So they almost have been a victim, I can say, of their own success. I wanted to just make a couple of points about the great work that the fire service has done since reform. We often in this chamber talk about collaboration. Since I've been an MSP for 8 years, goodness, 8 years, it's getting on. 8 years, there has always been conversation about collaboration. But the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service really put that into action. I was reading earlier on and I met with the Chief Fire Officer actually a couple of weeks ago, and we talked about the great collaboration between SFRS and the ambulance service out of hospital cardiac arrest corresponding trials. That's an excellent example of that public service working together to achieve a common aim. The primary aim of the trials was to reduce response times to incidents with a longer-term aim of improving patient outcomes. While they're on hold at the moment, given current negotiations on pay, the trials can absolutely be hailed as a success. During these call-outs, SFRS made 83 potential life-saving interventions with 28 positive outcomes. We also should look at the important statistics around safety. Fires have been reducing. Danny Johnson right to make that point. It's a long-term trend, but nonetheless, since 2010, I know fires have reduced by 33%. Fire deaths reduced 29%. That is not by accident in the same period. That's not by accident or coincidence, but very much at the heart and the root of the good work and the preventative work that our fire officers do. And I think every single one of us will have stories from within our own constituency of the excellent preventative work that SFRS have done in our high schools and so on and so forth. Of course, I give way.
Daniel Johnson.
Thank the Cabinet Secretary. And indeed, I think it's important that we don't overlook the fire service, nor should we overlook some of the concerns that have been raised by the Fire Brigades Union, amongst others, about the reduction in fire numbers, about the need for appliances to be sent over the country just to provide those basic covers. So just wondering if the Cabinet Secretary would acknowledge that there are issues within the fire service and indeed criticisms that have been raised by the FBU, amongst others.
Hamza Yousaf.
I did look at the FBU briefing that came in, and I would say, just to give some reassurance, and of course there are challenges, but I just wanted to really spend a couple of minutes or a few minutes recognising the great successes of our fire officers. I don't think it gets as much time in this debate as always, but just to give some reassurances to Daniel Johnson, if I can. Of course, over the last year there has been an increase in the number of fire officers, firefighters. We have more firefighters per head of the population in Scotland than other parts of the UK. And as I say, the number of operational firefighters as of 31st of March 2019 was 184 higher than the previous year. But that's not to take away from the concerns around the retained duty system and others that people have mentioned. If I can, Presiding Officer, just move on to yes.
Margaret Mitchell.
Thank you for taking the intervention. I wonder if you could just dwell for a minute on the issue of the retained firefighter, because there's a real danger that is going to undermine, if it isn't resolved, all the excellent work that you've just explained quite correctly that the fire brigade have been doing.
Hamza Yousaf.
I will, of course, I will reflect to the Minister who's not here. I know she works hard very much on this issue, but it would be fair to say that the number of whole-time retained officers, the retained duty system has increased by 91 in the last 12 months. There has been a small reduction of 15 in the volunteer firefighters, but the core issues around the RDS are not lost on me and not lost on the Minister for Community Safety either. In the remaining time that I have, can I actually echo what Maurice Corrie said, and I think it was very important, and others, I think Gordon Lyndhurst made this point too, that we should really applaud our police officers and never ever get complacent about the sacrifice that they make day in and day out. And if ever we needed a reminder of that in the last couple of months, so the terrible and tragic death, murder of PC Andrew Harper, Thames Valley, and closer to home, PC Buggins, who died on duty in Montrose. We owe them all a debt of gratitude that simply we could not repay them. Can I thank members for what I thought was a very helpful and nuanced debate. I wanted to pick up on a few points, if I may. I also want to echo James Kelly's praise of Daniel Johnson this time in the Justice Committee. I have often said I enjoyed working with Daniel Johnson. I'm sure we'll work together because he'll take a clear interest in justice issues. I agree with him on that collaborative approach. I'm sure it's one that James Kelly will take in the new role. I see him smirking mischievously at that suggestion, but I'm sure he will take that role, take that collaborative approach moving forward. But I did take one issue, perhaps what Daniel Johnson said, was that he seemed to make a suggestion that the really only metrics of success for the Scottish Government are the 1,000 additional police officers, which is not something that we are pinned to. Of course, we now say that it's for the Chief Constable to determine the right mix of police officers, but also that we say that the creation of the National Police Service, these are the only two matrix of success. That they aren't. I mean, pragmatically and practically, what we do is look to see what the effect of the National Police Service is on the ground, and the very practical difference that it's made to people is, for example, the second lowest crime rate in over 4 decades, the vast majority, if not all murders, solved and detected, investigations of sexual offences much better, domestic abuse getting a much greater focus. The majority of people think that police do a good job in their local area as well, as according to the Crime and Justice survey. So there are a number of matrix and indices that we use, but they are focused on what the practical and pragmatic difference is to people very much in their lives every day. I see I'm running out of time, so if I can also commend this debate. I was going to talk about budgets and resources. The debate will rage on, no doubt, and of course I hear the concerns that members have. I think we're in a good place post-reform. There are still, of course, challenges, but the government is very up for taking on those challenges. But I thank the members for what I thought was a very good debate.
I now call on Rona Mackay to wind up the debate on behalf of the Justice Committee. Would you take us up to decision time, please, Ms Mackay?
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, this has been a wide-ranging debate about two of our most valued public services, and I've listened to the contributions with great interest. I think it's been a good-humoured and a consensual debate. Can I just firstly quickly thank Daniel Johnson for being an excellent colleague on the committee, and to welcome James Kelly. Look forward to working with you. When the Justice Committee decided to undertake post-legislative scrutiny on the police service, there was a view being expressed by some that the police service is in crisis. I'm pleased to say that following the committee's scrutiny of every area of policing covered by the Act, the evidence was clear. There is no crisis in policing. It's important to put that on the record. That's not to say there aren't some improvements needed, and we've heard members detail them, and I'll go on to outline some as well as referring to what we've heard from across the chamber. There are great success stories from the creation of a single police service, particularly in the field of specialist services, as the convener mentioned. I thought the convener gave a very accurate account of the evidence we heard, which formed the report. The committee was struck by the evidence it received that the single service has improved how it deals with victims of domestic abuse, rape and sexual offences, and as mentioned by my colleague Jenny Gilruth, Rape Crisis Scotland told the committee that in our experience the move to a single police force has transformed the way rape and other sexual crimes are investigated in Scotland. This has been achieved through the training of police officers and the use of specialist officers. Scottish Women's Aid told the committee that the police service's response to reported domestic abuse has improved dramatically in some places, and that the single force has produced a better informed, targeted and more consistent approach to the investigation of domestic abuse. As co-convener of the cross-party group on men's violence against women and children, I believe this is a great step forward, especially in light of the increase that we've seen in reporting of these crimes. Presiding Officer, governance and oversight of policing played a large part of the committee's scrutiny. We heard concerns about whether the SPA is adequately fulfilling its roles of scrutinising the police service, and this included a lack of critical challenge and consultation. The subcommittee's recent inquiry into the proposal for police officers to use cyber kiosks, which were mentioned by John Finney and Liam MacArthur, to search the phones of witnesses and victims of crimes, highlighted this issue, and it was a very important piece of work done by the subcommittee. The conclusion was that the SPA must consult more widely on all proposals and be far more open and accountable, and I believe this is now being put into practice, and I look forward to the SPA review that the convener mentioned. Presiding Officer, there have been a number of thoughtful contributions from members today, and I'll just go through some of them. Margaret Mitchell talks about backfilling, and Police Scotland will be carrying out an analysis of demand data, which we look forward to seeing. Daniel Johnson talked of the capital backlog. Cabinet Secretary said his door was always open to discuss issues around the fleet, estate, etc. Liam Kerr and James Kelly talked about the SPA, some of the historic problems there, also backfilling, recruitment problems, and said that we had learned lessons and we must learn for the future. John Finney spoke about human rights, the importance of human rights, and said that Police Scotland are the frontline defenders of human rights, and I couldn't agree more. He also spoke about centralisation and how it impacts on the day-to-day operation of policing. Liam MacArthur spoke of accountability and transparency, took a bit of a trip down memory lane, painted quite a gloomy picture, I would say, of the evidence that we heard. Okay, balanced, I'm told. Fulton McGregor talked of the positive changes of reform and how the public feels safer, and the local success in crime rate, local area success in crime rate. Gordon Lyndhurst, concern over the long-term strategy regarding funding. Cabinet Secretary said the government would fund deficits to avoid drastic cuts in the service. Daniel Johnson rightly praised police officers and talked of the demands in police and the changing nature of crime these days, and also the capital funding issues. Shona Robson spoke of the origins of the reform and the policy intentions. Despite being issues in the early days, she said things have improved. And Oliver Medell spoke of initially saying that there were other ways of achieving the outcomes, but that concerns were being listened to, and he talked of local knowledge and accountability. So I'd like to turn now to the committee's report on the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service. Presiding Officer. Our evidence concluded that the service has met or made good progress in meeting the three main policy intentions of the Act. And I echo the remarks made by the Cabinet Secretary in his closing remarks. On balance, the committee found that the fire service has protected and improved local services, despite many challenges such as issues with recruiting and keeping retained and volunteer firefighters, particularly in remote and rural areas. However, recruitment issues and budgetary pressure means appliances often can't be used to respond to call-outs due to either a shortage of staff or staff being diverted as emergency medical responders. Presiding Officer, I believe these issues need to be addressed urgently for the safety of the public and the health and safety of our fire service staff, and I'm confident that the Government will take them very seriously. Despite growing demands, the fire service has responded to every single emergency call with an appropriate response and made good progress towards creating more equal access to specialist support and national capacity. The committee heard the connection between services and communities have been strengthened, with more local councillors now making decisions about how fire and rescue services are delivered in their areas. It has made great progress, but does face many challenges. John Finney, James Kelly and Fulton McGregor spoke of the Fire Brigade Union's concerns and the need to negotiate in good faith, and I believe that too. The changing role of firefighters is obvious. They are now the first responders and they have many new challenges to address, and I think that has to be reflected in any negotiation. So in conclusion, Presiding Officer, I'd like to thank those who provided evidence and suggestions for ways to improve the legislation, and I'd also like to thank the clerks for all their hard work. The committee recognised that the dedication, commitment and hard work of police officers, firefighters and staff during a period of significant change is responsible for the many successes of the police and fire and rescue services. We owe them a huge debt for embracing this transformational change with their customary professionalism and hard work. And on behalf of the committee, I would like to place on record our thanks to them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Convener, and that concludes this afternoon's debate. There is, in fact, only one question to be put to the Chamber as a result of today's business. The question is that motion 18818 in the name of Margaret Mitchell on post-legislative scrutiny reports on the Police and Fire Reform Scotland Act 2012 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed, and that concludes decision time. I close this meeting.